On April 18, 1942, 16 twin-engine bombers roared off the deck of an aircraft carrier in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, something everyone said couldn't be done. The B-25 Mitchell, a medium bomber designed for runways 3 times longer than a carrier deck, had no business attempting what its crews were about to do. But 4 months after Pearl Harbor, with America reeling from defeat after defeat across the Pacific, President Roosevelt wanted to hit back at Japan's homeland. He wanted to prove that the war could reach Tokyo itself. What followed became one of the most audacious missions in military history, a raid that defied conventional wisdom, violated standard operating procedures, and accomplished something that seemed impossible on paper. The Doolittle Raid, named for the man who planned and led it, was never going to win the war. Everyone involved knew that. But winning wasn't really the point. The strategic situation in early 1942 was bleak. Japanese forces had swept through the Pacific with terrifying speed and efficiency. Wake Island had fallen. Guam was gone. The Philippines were under siege. British colonial forces in Singapore had surrendered in what Churchill called the worst disaster in British military history. Hong Kong, Burma, the Dutch East Indies, all occupied. The Japanese military machine appeared unstoppable, and American morale was in free fall. Franklin Roosevelt understood something fundamental about war that transcends purely military calculations. Armies and navies don't fight in a vacuum. Public support matters. Morale matters. The psychological dimension of warfare can be just as decisive as logistics or firepower. In those dark early months of 1942, America needed proof that it could strike back. It needed hope. It needed a symbol that Japan's home islands weren't invincible. Enter Lieutenant Colonel James Harold Doolittle, a name that already meant something in American aviation. Before the war, Doolittle had been a racing pilot, an aeronautical engineer, and the first pilot to perform an outside loop. He'd earned a doctorate from MIT. He'd won the Schneider Trophy and the Bendix Trophy. He understood aircraft and what they could and supposedly couldn't do. The Navy had been working on the problem independently. Captain Francis Lowe walked past Naval Air Station Norfolk one day in January 1942 and watched Navy pilots practicing carrier takeoffs on a runway painted with a carrier deck outline. The sight sparked an idea. What if you could launch Army bombers from a carrier, not land them? That would be impossible, but launch them. Admiral Ernest King liked the concept. He brought it to Army Air Forces Commander Henry Hap Arnold, who immediately thought of Doolittle. The plan took shape quickly. Medium bombers would launch from a carrier somewhere in the Pacific, strike targets in Japan, then continue west to land at airfields in China. The bombers would be B-25 Mitchells, named for the controversial air power advocate Billy Mitchell. The B-25 was a relatively new design, first flown in 1940, with twin engines and a crew of 5. It could carry a decent bomb load and had enough range for the mission barely, but nobody had ever launched a fully loaded B-25 from a carrier deck. The Mitchell had a takeoff roll of roughly 1,500 feet under normal conditions. The USS Hornet's flight deck was only 800 feet long. Simple math said it couldn't work. Doolittle didn't accept that conclusion. He believed that with modifications, careful calculation, and skillful piloting, they could make it happen. The modifications began immediately. Engineers stripped everything non-essential from the aircraft. The ventral turret came out. Liaison radios were removed. Even the tail recognition lights were pulled. In their place, additional fuel tanks went in, one in the bomb bay, one in the crawl space above the bomb bay, and one in the passageway behind the cockpit. The B-25s would carry 141 gallons of fuel, far beyond their standard capacity. Every pound mattered. Every gallon of fuel meant more range, more options, a slightly better chance of making it to China. Armament stayed minimal. The Norden bombsight standard equipment for precision bombing was deemed too valuable to risk over Japan. The crews would aim visually. Each B-25 would carry 4 500-pound bombs, 3 high explosive and 1 bundle of incendiaries. Not enough firepower to do serious damage to Japan's war industry, but enough to make a statement. Doolittle handpicked volunteers from the 17th Bombardment Group. He didn't tell them what the mission was. He couldn't. The men only knew they were training for something dangerous, something special. They practiced short-field takeoffs at Eglin Field in Florida, getting the B-25s off the ground in progressively shorter distances. The pilots learned to hold the brakes, run the engines up to full power, release the brakes and haul the yoke back the moment they had flying speed. There was no room for hesitation, no chance for a second attempt. 24 crews trained. 16 would go. The selection process was brutal. Every pilot wanted in. These were men who'd volunteered for military service, volunteered for aviation, and now volunteered again for a mission they knew might kill them. The crews that made the cut represented the best the Army Air Forces had to offer. On April 2nd, 1942, 16 B-25s were loaded aboard the USS Hornet at Naval Air Station Alameda in California. The sight drew crowds. Soldiers and sailors gathered to watch Army bombers being hoisted onto a Navy carrier's deck. The rumor mill went into overdrive. Everyone knew something big was happening, but nobody knew exactly what. The crews themselves didn't learn their target until after the Hornet left port. The Hornet joined up with Vice Admiral William Halsey's Task Force 16, centered on the carrier USS Enterprise. The combined force represented a significant portion of America's remaining Pacific fleet: 2 carriers, cruisers, destroyers, oilers, and submarines. If Japanese forces caught them, the loss would be catastrophic. The Navy was risking irreplaceable assets for a mission that couldn't possibly do major strategic damage. That's how important the psychological objective was. Doolittle briefed his crews once they were at sea. They were going to bomb Tokyo. The room erupted in cheers. These men who'd trained for weeks without knowing where they'd strike finally understood the magnitude of what they'd volunteered for. They'd be the first American airmen to bomb the Japanese homeland. They'd bring the war to Tokyo. But there was a catch. Several catches, actually. The plan called for launching roughly 400 miles from Japan, close enough to give the B-25s range to reach China, far enough to keep the carriers safe. After bombing their targets, the crews would fly approximately 200 miles to airfields in China, held by friendly forces. The Chinese would refuel and rearm them, or at least provide safe haven. Nobody discussed what happened if they didn't make it to China. Nobody talked about ditching in the ocean or crash landing in Japanese-occupied territory. The crews understood the risks. They'd volunteered anyway. The task force steamed west across the Pacific, maintaining radio silence, avoiding shipping lanes. Every sailor aboard knew they were deep in enemy waters. Japanese submarines patrolled these areas. Japanese aircraft flew reconnaissance missions. Discovery meant battle, and battle meant the mission would fail before it started. On the morning of April 7th, roughly 650 miles from Tokyo, the task force encountered Japanese picket boats, small fishing vessels equipped with radios stationed far from Japan's coast to give early warning of approaching threats. The cruiser USS Nashville opened fire, sinking 1 boat, but not before it transmitted a warning signal. The alarm had been raised. Halsey made the call immediately. Launch now. They were still 170 miles farther from Japan than planned, which meant the B-25s would have to fly that much farther. On the return leg to China distance, most of them didn't have the fuel to cover. But waiting meant the task force would be discovered and destroyed. Better to launch early and give the bombers a chance than wait and guarantee failure. Doolittle's plane was positioned first on the Hornet's deck. The carrier turned into the wind, pitching in heavy seas. Waves crashed over the bow. The deck crew struggled to keep their footing. Everything had to be timed perfectly. Launch at the moment when the carrier's bow was rising, giving the heavily loaded bomber just a bit more lift. Doolittle ran up his engines. The deck officer watched the ship's movement, waited for the right moment, and gave the signal. Doolittle released his brakes. The B-25 accelerated down the deck engines, screaming, the aircraft buffeted by wind and the carrier's motion. The nose lifted. The wheels left the deck with only a few feet to spare. Doolittle dropped toward the water, gained airspeed, and climbed away. One by one, the other 15 B-25s followed. Crews watched each other launch, hearts pounding, knowing their turn was coming. Every takeoff was a controlled crisis. Too slow, and you'd stall off the deck into the ocean. Too fast, and you might not have the range to reach China. The deck crew worked with desperate efficiency, positioning each bomber, checking everything one final time. The last aircraft, piloted by Lieutenant William Farrow, roared off the deck at 09:20. All 16 B-25s were airborne. The Hornet and her escorts immediately turned east and ran for home. They'd done their part. The rest was up to Doolittle and his crews. The bombers flew in groups of 2 or 3 toward Japan, staying low to avoid radar detection. The early launch had created problems, but it had also created opportunities. Japanese defenders had received the warning from the picket boat, but they expected an attack from carriers much closer to shore. They weren't looking for bombers approaching from 600 miles out. The B-25s crossed the Japanese coast around noon. Air raid sirens sounded in Tokyo, but authorities assumed it was another drill. The city had conducted numerous exercises in previous months. Citizens went about their Saturday afternoon routines. Factories operated at full capacity. Nobody believed American bombers could possibly reach the home islands. Doolittle's crew bombed, first hitting industrial targets in Tokyo, then diving to rooftop level and racing for the coast. The other bombers spread out across their assigned targets: Tokyo, Yokohama, Nagoya, Kobe, and Osaka. The attacks were scattered and uncoordinated by design. Hitting multiple cities simultaneously would maximize confusion and make it harder for Japanese forces to respond. The bombing did minimal physical damage. 16 bombers carrying 4 bombs each couldn't seriously harm Japan's industrial capacity. A few factories sustained damage. Several military installations were hit. Some residential areas caught fire. In strategic terms, the raid barely registered. But in psychological terms, the impact was enormous. Japanese radio broadcasters had spent months telling their audiences that the home islands were impregnable, that American forces were weak, and demoralized that Japan's defensive perimeter was absolute. Now, American bombers had appeared over Tokyo in broad daylight. The bombs were real. The fires were real. The threat was real. Japan's military leadership panicked. Emperor Hirohito had been in danger. One bomber had flown directly over the imperial palace. The raid exposed catastrophic failures in Japan's air defense system. Fighters scrambled late. Anti-aircraft fire was ineffective. The Americans had escaped with no losses over Japan itself. The Japanese public was shaken. If bombers could reach Tokyo, nowhere was safe. The government imposed strict censorship, but rumors spread anyway. Morale suffered. The myth of invincibility had been shattered. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, commander of the combined fleet, understood immediately what the raid meant. Japan's defensive perimeter had to be extended. American carriers had proven they could strike at will. The only solution was to draw the American fleet into battle and destroy it decisively. This logic would drive Japan's decision to attack Midway 6 weeks later, a decision that would result in Japan's most catastrophic naval defeat of the war. But all of that came later. On April 18th, Doolittle and his crews were fighting for survival. The early launch had cost them roughly 170 miles of range fuel they didn't have. The B-25s flew west across the East China Sea toward airfields in China. Daylight faded. Weather deteriorated. Rain and fog reduced visibility to near zero. Radio navigation aids that were supposed to guide them to friendly airfields weren't operating. The Chinese forces hadn't been properly notified of the mission, a catastrophic communications failure. One by one, the bombers ran out of fuel. Some crews bailed out over China in darkness, parachuting blindly into unknown terrain. Others attempted crash landings, putting their aircraft down in rice paddies on hillsides, wherever they could find relatively flat ground. One crew made it to the Soviet Union and landed at Vladivostok, where they were interned for more than a year before escaping to Iran. Lieutenant Ted Lawson, pilot of the B-25, nicknamed Ruptured Duck, crashed in the surf off the Chinese coast. The impact shattered his leg. His crew pulled him from the wreckage and carried him inland where Chinese guerrillas found them. Lawson would eventually be evacuated, but doctors had to amputate his leg. His account of the raid, published after the war under the title 30 Seconds Over Tokyo, became one of the most widely read first-hand accounts of the mission. Not everyone survived. 8 raiders were captured by Japanese forces in occupied China. The Japanese military classified them as war criminals for bombing civilian areas, a charge with bitter irony given Japan's actions in China since 1937. 3 prisoners were executed. 1 died of disease and malnutrition in captivity. 4 survived imprisonment and were liberated when the war ended. Chinese civilians paid a terrible price for helping the American airmen. The Japanese military launched the Zhejiang Jiangxi campaign in retaliation, a 2-month operation that killed an estimated 250,000 Chinese civilians. Entire villages that had aided the raiders were destroyed. The brutality was systematic and deliberate punishment for helping America strike at Japan. Doolittle thought the mission was a failure. He'd lost all 16 aircraft. Most of his crews were scattered across China or in Japanese hands. He'd expected to be court-martialed. When he finally made his way back to American lines, he learned the truth. He'd been promoted to Brigadier General and awarded the Medal of Honor. The mission had been a spectacular success. The Doolittle Raid accomplished exactly what Roosevelt and the military leadership had hoped for. American newspapers ran banner headlines about the attack on Tokyo. Morale soared. The narrative shifted from one of continuous defeat to one of fighting back. Americans could strike at Japan's homeland. The war wasn't hopeless. More importantly, the raid forced Japan to divert resources to homeland defense resources that might have been used elsewhere. Fighter units stayed in Japan instead of deploying to the Pacific. Anti-aircraft guns were installed around Japanese cities. The psychological security of the home islands had been compromised, and Japan would spend enormous effort trying to restore it. The strategic ripple effects were even more significant. Yamamoto's decision to attack Midway, driven partly by the need to prevent future carrier raids on Japan, led directly to the Battle of Midway in June 1942. At Midway, American dive bombers caught Japanese carriers with their aircraft rearming and refueling on deck. The Japanese lost 4 fleet carriers in a single day. The balance of naval power in the Pacific shifted permanently. Could Yamamoto have been drawn into battle at Midway without the Doolittle Raid? Possibly. But the raid accelerated Japan's strategic timeline and contributed to the pressure on Japanese commanders to act decisively in wartiming matters. The Doolittle Raid disrupted Japan's timeline and forced decisions that Japan's leadership might have made differently with more time to consider them. The B-25 Mitchell went on to become one of the most successful medium bombers of World War II. More than 10,000 were produced. They served in every theatre of the war, performing anti-submarine patrols, ground attack missions, and strategic bombing. But the Mitchell's most famous moment came on that April morning when 16 of them accomplished something impossible, launching from a carrier deck bombing Japan and changing the psychological trajectory of the war. Doolittle continued to serve with distinction, commanding air forces in North Africa, the Mediterranean, and Europe. He pioneered techniques for strategic bombing and close air support. After the war, he returned to civilian life and the aerospace industry, remaining active in aviation until his death in 1993 at age 96. He never forgot his crew members who hadn't made it back from the Tokyo raid. The raid's survivors held reunions for decades afterward, meeting annually to remember the mission and honor those who'd been lost. They shared a bond that only combat veterans truly understand, the knowledge that they'd done something extraordinary together, something that mattered. The last surviving raider, Lieutenant Colonel Richard Cole, Doolittle's co-pilot on the mission, died in 2019 at age 103. The raid proved something fundamental about warfare and human nature. Sometimes the impossible is only impossible until someone does it. Conventional wisdom said medium bombers couldn't launch from carriers. The experts were wrong. Strategic doctrine said the risk to the carrier task force wasn't worth the minimal damage the bombers could inflict. The experts missed the point. War isn't purely about mathematics and logistics. It's about will. It's about proving to your enemy and to yourself that you can fight back. In April 1942, America needed to prove it could strike at Japan. Jimmy Doolittle and 80 brave men provided that proof. They launched bombers from a carrier-bombed Tokyo and showed the world that Japan could be reached. The physical damage was negligible, the psychological impact was incalculable, and sometimes in war psychology matters more than tonnage.